Good day. What we're going to talk about today in the history class is the technological advances that took place in the early to late 1800s. These are incredibly important because these would lay the groundwork for societal change, reformation in technology, and also just the economic differences that would develop in different countries that would allow these countries to develop the powerhouses that they needed in order to fight in World War One. So we're going to look at this. It should be a shorter video than last time, but equally as important as we look at some of the different technology, some of the different science advances, and different things that took place across this area of the world. In your books, you should be on page 248. What we're looking at here is two main areas, science and technology. Science is basically the application of the natural world that we live in. How do we use the world that we live in to better us and different things there? There's some things that were very helpful and very useful, very important that were needed to be used here. First of all, we're going to look at a man named James Maxwell. He predicted something that would drastically alter our world and actually would not make this communication that you and I are doing now possible if he had not discovered what he did. Now, yes, granted, somebody may have discovered it later, but he was the first one to theorize it and really make it popular. What he said was that there are existence of radio waves. All around us all the time, especially today, there are radio waves that are going around us. The reason your radio is called a radio is because of the radio waves that you receive from the broadcast station. He said, and at least theorized, that there is a way to send broadcasts through the air and be picked up with the possibility of being able to understand that, the wireless communication that he was theorizing there. This was all the way back again in the 1800s. 1831 was when he was born, died in 1879. So right there in the middle of the century that was there. And he said this. Now, he was a scientific genius of his time, very, very intelligent man, and said that there is the possibility of these radio waves. So to try to figure it out, he did a lot of work on electricity, magnetism, and optics that developed into models that later Albert Einstein would be able to use for some of his great technology and technological and scientific advances that they find. Now, he did not actually discover these things, but the fact that he theorized it and started moving towards that did really help in the future. The next thing we're going to look at is a Frenchman named Louis Pasteur. Now, on your page there, it looks like Louis Pasteur, but it's not. It's French, so it's Louis and Pasteur. Now, I wish I could ask you guys by a show of hands if you recognize the name Pasteur. What I'm going to do today with the different questions, because I saw last time you guys answered the question in the comments section, was that you went through and just answered them individually. So you'd have multiple different comments that were on there. What I'm going to have you do this time, when you answer the questions in the comment section, is wait till the end of the video and then answer all the questions in the same comment. That'll be a little bit easier on you and a little bit easier on me when I go through reviewing it. So let me ask you that question. Does the name Pasteur sound familiar, that word, Pasteur? Now, with that, write down on a piece of paper what you think the answer is, because obviously in a couple of seconds I'm going to give you the answer, so I don't want you cheating. So write down, take a moment there, maybe pause the video if you need to, and write down what you think is pasture, if you've heard that phrase before, that word. And if you have, what do you think it means? What is it from there? I'm also going to write the question down here so I remember what I'm dealing with. All right, that should have given you enough time to pause the video and write down the question, the answer there. Pasteur was a French chemist that made some important discoveries that helped with disease. Today, we understand, especially with what's going on in the world right now with the coronavirus that's happening, that there is a big push to wash your hands, to sneeze into your arm, or cover your mouth, especially if you sneeze. You see a lot of cultures and people wearing the masks over their face to protect themselves or protect others from them. And all of these things are because we understand a lot of things about diseases that they did not understand back then. One of the things we understand about disease is that it's spread through germs. It goes through there. They didn't fully understand this completely. They thought maybe there was something in there. But Pasteur goes through and develops an idea of helping to purify liquids by boiling them, specifically milk. I was talking to one of my students a few weeks ago about boiled milk and why it is important to do that. For those who don't understand, milk comes from the udder of a cow. being on the bottom part of the cow, cows don't really care where they sit or what they sit in, generally speaking. So their udder, when they're in the field, another cow's gone to the bathroom, possibility of stuff getting on their udder where the milk comes from is a pretty big deal. Well, those germs and that bacteria that develops on the udder or even in the area there, maybe the pails are not as clean or the hands of the farmer are not as clean. And so germs would get inside the milk, and when people would drink it, they would get sick from that. Well, he developed this idea of pasteurization. That's where you probably heard it before. It is boiling liquids to slow the development of microbes that they have there. We call this pasteurization because of Louis Pasteur and what he did. Now, some of you may have guessed that pasture, like where fields and sheep and cows were, and that's a good guess. But no, we see the pasteurization word because of Louis Pasteur, and it's actually named after him there. And so, if you get pasteurized milk, is basically where the milk has been boiled in a large vat to help kill off these microbes to keep them from growing as quickly. And it's very helpful, very useful. Any milk that you buy in a major supermarket, unless otherwise mentioned, is pasteurized. Now, if somebody goes to a farmer's market or something like that and they drink what is called raw milk, chances are that it may not have been pasteurized. Probably has been to kill the microbes, but the raw milk is a little bit different with that there, but all the milk you will get from a store, major Walmart, Target, Martin's, Food Lion, those kind of things, Ingles, Bilo, those are pasteurized milks to stop the microbes there. He also made big contributions in disproving a theory or an idea. There was a theory throughout history, the scientific history, of something called spontaneous generation. Spontaneous means that it just happens. Nothing actually caused it to happen. It just comes into existence and happens. The idea was that different things went and would just appear. One of the theories was that there were uh, flies and maggots were spontaneous generation, or they came from the meat themselves. So I don't know if Pasteur was the one that did this or not, but one of the scientific experiments was that they set out two different cups and put meat in it so that it would rot. And one of the cups they left open so it was free to the air. The other one they put a net over to keep anything from coming in there. And what they found out was both meats, as they began to rot, and as began to happen there, that if spontaneous generation was true, both of them would have maggots and then eventually have flies crawling on them. Well, the one that was open definitely had the flies and maggots on there, but the one that was surrounded by the netting on top of the cup was not. There were flies on top and the bacteria. Definitely, they could see the decay of the meat there. But they began to realize, these don't spontaneously combust, or they are not existent in the meat to begin with. It actually comes from something different, and they were able to figure it out there. He also went and designed a flask that allowed air to enter, but kept dust and microbes from coming into the mix. And so what this flask allowed him to realize was that he tried different yeast that would grow bacteria, and he said, okay, let's see, will this actually grow the bacteria that we think it will? And it did not. It did not take place there. Another man that we want to look at here is Charles Darwin, somebody that has had massive effect and change on the scientific discoveries and scientific thought over the past almost 200 years. Now, Charles Darwin, when he was going through and what he was doing, developed the idea of what we know as survival of the fittest, which is called Darwinian evolution. Now, evolution had been around before Darwin, but because of his ideas, his beliefs, some would even say his findings, it really helped to push this idea of survival of the fittest, where nature tends to go from a situation where they need to adapt, so they evolve into it. Whatever survives, that was the most fit. That was the part that was most needed there. That's why certain animals live in certain parts of the world, because all of the animals may have evolved from that area to begin with, but some were not fit to live in that terrain, so they died off. And the fit ones, they survived. Survival of the fittest. Now, he went through, his father had actually sent him to Cambridge to study to be a pastor. He knew about God. He understood about these things here, about the Bible. Some people say he even may have been a Christian, but it's hard to tell. And we're not going to theorize one way or the other whether he was or was not. But he did go on a 5-year voyage as a naturalist on the HMS, or Her Majesty's ship, HMS Beagle. Now, a naturalist on a ship, it was their job, is when they travel to different places, was to go and see the local plants and local animals, to record them, to take record of them, and then at the end, as they were going through there, maybe they came to an island that they hadn't known before. What plants and animals were safe to eat? Was the water safe to drink? And the naturalist was a very important part because it took a lot of logs and a lot of documents. Well, he went to an area of the world where there were a lot of different islands. And on these islands were different types of birds. And each type of bird, it was all the same family. It was the finch family. And while he was going through there, he saw that some of the birds had developed different types of beaks for the different areas that were there. And so he saw this as a evidence of evolution, of small micro changes, that the reason it developed this way, the beak was able to use against hard nuts over here, was able to eat the soft fruit over here. And so the beak developed differently, it evolved differently, was his theory. And so he saw that, and what began to show that they evolved to what they needed. And again, that's a Darwinian evolution, the survival of the fittest. He also, what affected his thinking was he began to realize some different things. That he questioned, how could a good God, a God that was good, God that was gracious, that was loving, as the Bible teaches, how could that God allow pain and suffering to be in the world? And he had had a lot of suffering in his life and a lot of different things there. And he began to theorize that God didn't actually have anything, or at least very little, to do with creation or the sustaining of the world anymore. One of the things that helped him believe this was actually the death of his 10-year-old daughter. Helped prove his point. He says, well, if God was truly loving, if God was truly kind, she would not have had to have died. Well, as we know, because of sin is in the world, because of different things that way, that there is pain and suffering. But this pushed him to believe these ideas that were there and that different things took place. His theory that he began to develop assumed that natural selection came through. That is where man came from. That whatever was the most fit, whatever was the most beneficial to man, that's the part of the technology that he that was the part of nature that kept going, whereas all the other traits died off. That's why we have what we have and not what we don't have, because those particular missing links died off because they were not fit. And so a big change there. He wrote 2 books. One of them, The Origin of Species. This one is often quoted and put out as the beginning of his Darwinian evolution, and then also The Descent of Man, which led to changes in science and influences on society. And as scientists began to apply their theories here, they began to reject God. Because again, he had rejected God, his own idea and mindset. How could a gracious, good God do these things? And so as people began to read and learn and um, really agree with his positions, they began to push God out of their own thinking as well. So that is the science side of things that we talked about there. Now we want to look at technology. And this part is incredibly important because, again, we see some major changes technologically that affect the world for the rest of history. First of all is the railroad. Now, I want to look here just at the word railroad. This is your second question here. Why do you think a railroad is called a railroad? Again, on your piece of paper that you have there with you, write down what you think the answer is, and answer all of the questions at the same time at the end in the comment section below. But why was it called a railroad? I'll give you a moment to write that down. Feel free to pause the video to do that. Now, I'm going to give you the answer. Make sure you paused it and wrote down your answer first. Why it was called a railroad is because it was literally a road made of rails. One of the first railroads that was ever used was actually used in 1807, and it was made of wooden rails. They used it to get these carts they put on the rails, and they found that the rails, even though they're made of wood, would direct the cart much more easily than regular wheels that would just go on the ground or the dirt that was there. And so they go through and be able to do that. That was back in 1807, so just about 35 years after the American Revolution. So not long after that. Many of the people who fought in the revolution would have still been alive during this point. And so they go through there. To help also picture it, George Washington had been dead for about 8 years. And so not long after the revolution took place here. Well, then these wooden rails, they found that they broke down pretty quickly, and obviously so. So then they would take and they put metal caps on top of the wood of the rail. So you'd have the wooden rail, and then they would put the cap on top. That helped protect a little bit longer. Finally, they realized, what if we just make the entire rail out of metal? Now it's expensive. A lot of metal was needed to put for these things here. Eventually, the 1820s is when they started doing that. And it was really Great Britain, England, that started using these rails to transport goods and materials from different places there. And the Americans had to import metal rails from Europe, from Britain, as well as the locomotive and the train cars into the United States before we started making the industry on our own. A couple of interesting things. This is not in the book, but just to let you know about that in the year 1830 in the United States, there was about 30 miles of railroad line. In 1830, there were 30 miles. Then, in 1840, 10 years later, it had exploded to 2,800 miles of railroad. Then, in the 1860s, 20 years later, 30,000 miles. And in 1916, right before the United States enters World War I, there was over 254,000 miles. So to write those numbers out there for you, there was quite a big of a difference there. That you could see that it was growing quickly. Within 100 years, less than 100 years, the railroad lines had gone from no railroads in the entire United States to over 254,000 miles. Again, show you the numbers here, is that you would have 30 miles in the year 1830. Then you would have 2,800 10 years later. 20 years after that, 30,000. And then 50 years later, over 250,000 miles of railroad lines across the United States. Massive help to the economy and the different things there. The transportation was greatly changed for this because you can move more things further distances faster and cheaper. Some of the very first railroads were designed, the ones with the wooden and the metal caps. You could move 30 tons of material on a single thing up a hill, which is a pretty impressive thing. Now, granted, it only moved 4 miles per hour, but you could do that. And you can move all that transportation, all those things there. During the 1840s, as I mentioned, in the United States and in Britain, they started connecting all of these different railroad systems. You would have a railroad system at this little city here, a system here, and a system here, and then a system over here. Well, in the 1840s, in Britain and in America, when it started to become popular, they started combining all of these railroad lines so they could move goods and people to different areas very quickly. Whereas canals may dry up during the dry season or freeze over during the winter season, railroads didn't do that, and they became vastly important. The United States imported, like I said, its first rail lines from Britain to be able to use here. Eventually had the Continental Railroad went from the East Coast to the West Coast. And it was amazing help, amazing benefit there for the people that they were able to use. It cut transportation times in, or I was going to say in half, but it was even more than by almost 90%. So for instance, what would have taken somebody 9 days, 10 days to travel across the United States. It didn't, actually. If you're using covered wagon, it could take you up to 2 or 3 months to travel from the East Coast to the West Coast. What they did now with the railroad, you can do the same distance in about 5 days. Massive difference there. And that was a vital help to colonizing the West as they moved out there, because again, that helped them be able to go and develop that area that was there. Fun fact, it was in 1833, Andrew Jackson was the first, if I remember it was Andrew Jackson, was the first U.S. president to ride a railroad. Not only that, but it was in the United States during the Civil War. Stonewall Jackson's army actually coming from Winchester, Virginia area down to Strasburg, Virginia, and he was the first army in the world, in world history, or first general to transport his army over railroad lines to where they needed to go. And they went to the first Battle of Bull Run that they were there. First army in world history during wartime to be transported by railroad. And that drastically changed things because now they can move dozens of miles a day and you can move hundreds of miles very quickly that you'd have there without the wear and tear and fatigue on your soldiers or their uniforms and shoes. That moves us into the steamships. This is something here that they went through. Now, the way the steamship worked is that you would have a furnace that would burn coal, and that coal would go through and it would heat these vats of water, create steam. The steam would hit these turbines and spin, and then that would spin another part of the ship that would go through and create the force needed to move the ship. That's a basic teaching of how the steam engine worked. And so the steamships replaced the sail-driven ships. And this was incredibly helpful because the sails that would go through there, they only worked certain parts of the world because you needed the wind to go through. And rowing didn't work, but now no matter where you were, going upriver, downriver, on a lake, or on an ocean, the steam engines could get you where you needed to go. And it was very helpful there. They would quickly bring hundreds of passengers and thousands of tons of produce and product and also the mail between different countries very, very quickly. Now, as I mentioned, there was an important part of that equation, and that was coal. Coal actually drove the Industrial Revolution. Where different coal mines were, they needed to improve light or they needed to improve ventilation or something like that. So they created these technologies to be able to improve that. So then you get more coal, and then you can make more technologies and more coal. And steam engines, when those came through, the first steam engine was helped to pump water out of coal mines, and so you could use the coal for it, and just it drove the revolution that was there then, that industrial revolution. Well, coming on the scene was a new quote unquote coal, and that was gasoline or crude oil that was being used here. And that helped with the invention of the internal combustion that had there, where the tiny explosion on the inside by the lighting of the gas that was there would go and create that, either gasoline or diesel that they used there. And this developed what we have today is cars, automobiles, auto by itself, mobile, something that moves. And so Henry Ford, as we know, was able to use these very well to create the technology with that. And automobiles would play a small part at the beginning of the World War I, and an even bigger part near the end of the war. And then we have flight, as I'm sure many of you know, in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The Wright brothers, December 17th, 1903, developed the plane. Now, they only flew for a few moments, but they had shown that human flight like this was available. Now, they had what was called blimps and hot air balloons before this, but now they could actually control it very similar to a bird. And so they could do that. 1903, that happened. It's amazing to think of all of the technology we have today of helicopters, of jets, of airliners, different things like that. That technology, that idea is less than 125 years old. 2003 was the 100-year anniversary of that. That was only 17 years ago. It's amazing how far we've come through there. Now we're going to look at two things also that deal with information and communication, part of the technology. Again, the using of things that are around them. The telegraph. Now, you've probably heard of the telegraph before. You've also heard of something called Morse code. Some of you have taught this before. Now, Morse code was developed by Samuel Morse, who helped to develop the sending the signals, an electric signal over wires based off of the device that they had there. Now, Samuel Morse was not the person that invented everything, but he did go through and help create a better model of it. Now, telegraph comes from the Greek words of tele, meaning far, and graph, to write. So you're able to write something far away. And with the Morse code, the dots and the dashes, the beep, 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 you could send between 16 to 66 words a minute, depending on how fast you were of a transmitter and how fast the person recording it was, and obviously what the words were, depending on how big they were. But you'd be able to do that, to go through and send those words over the telegraph line that somebody would pick up on the other side and record, and then translate it from the Morse code, the dots and dashes, into English that was there. That was very, very helpful. And one of the reasons it's so helpful is because the telegraph, you could send these letters and these things here. What would once take weeks or months, depending on where you had to send it from, you could send it from one side of town to the other within minutes. you would have somebody getting the message. You could send it from one side of the United States to the other. And what would take weeks would now take place. Eventually, they were laying cables under the Atlantic Ocean. These ships would have these massive, massive long cables that were on them. They were called cable laying ships. And they would travel from one side of the Atlantic Ocean and they would run out all of these cables and it would sink to the Atlantic Ocean that would go through there. And then they would attach it to the part in Great Britain. So it would go from the United States to Great Britain, and now what used to take months and months of transportation, maybe a few weeks, depending on the speed of your ship and the route you took, would now take literal minutes to send a message of information from Great Britain to the United States. Great Britain also would lay cable, had laid cable in the ocean to India, and the world became much smaller. Now, obviously not physically smaller, but the fact that communication would take place there really helped. Then you would have the telephone. Many of you are probably watching this on a phone. And what happened there, again, the telephone, the word tele meaning far, a Greek word, and then phone is actually the Greek word for voice. So the telephone, to be able to do it there, the technology was not invented by Alexander Graham Bell, but he did help to develop a working technology of it. He was the first to patent it, so uh, he gets the credit. Alexander Graham Bell had one of the first telephone companies that they had go through there, and it was very beneficial for them. All right, that brings us to the end of our lesson. You do have the section review on page 253 that goes through there. And that's on the paper that I gave you. It says 243, but that's a typo. It's page 253 that you have. There will not be a video for Friday that we will go through. You have the assignments there on your paper that was given to you. And have it there. The two questions that I asked. One, what did you think Pasteur meant? And then two, why was it called a railroad? Make sure you answer those in the comments below. Again, feel free to share this with your friends. Like it and subscribe. That also help you get the different notifications of upcoming videos. Thanks. Have a good day.